Freedom versus control in 2022. In this episode, I'll be once again evaluating the global movement, the global freedom movement, as it continues to challenge the COVID restrictions that are taking place around the world. Of course, here in England, we are now relatively free of most of the restrictions and mandates that have gone before us. But the situation on a global scale is very, very different, with many different countries still facing draconian restrictions. And there's a clear message that we cannot rest on our laurels in pursuit of freedom. Tonight, I intend to cover the origins of the Canadian convoy, more so what's happened over the weekend and the latest developments, but also some of the other convoys that have begun to take place around the world in synergy with the Canadian convoy. But I bring this breaking news to you today, here on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day. Love must be in the air, change must be in the air. But Ontario in Canada has announced that they will be or easing at least some of the COVID. It says it's going to remove the VAT passports from the 1st of March and lift some of the capacity limits starting from February the 17th. They'll be lifting the proof of vaccination requirements from all settings, including businesses, although they've stipulated that private sector businesses may continue to require proof of vaccination if they so choose. However, mask mandates and limits on social gatherings will still remain. The government, of course, denies that the lifting of restrictions is a result of the freedom convoys. But as I'll describe within this episode, you must surely see that these efforts are making a difference, and it's important, therefore, that as a global citizens, we stand together against these particular draconian mandates that continue to exist around the world. Now, as you may or may not know, thousands of truckers have driven into the capital of Canada and barraged the city with the noise of truck horns, creating a cacophony of sound in protest against these mandates. And elsewhere on the border between the United States and Canada, truckers, farmers, cowboys, the publics have blockaded traffic since the initial convoy descended back on January the 29th in protest of the new federal mandates that require long-haul truckers to be vaccinated against COVID in order to re-enter the country. I was reflecting on this over the weekend. There was a tweet that went out saying that truckers need to be vaccinated in order to do their job, but you can go to the Oscars and it doesn't matter if you're vaccinated or not. So you can go and sit amongst friends in a social environment and watch the Oscars. But you can't sit in a secluded cabin by yourself being unvaccinated. Just a little bit of irony to that notion. None of it makes sense. We know that. That's why we're here. It's also clear that the unvaccinated Canadian drivers will be required to quarantine on return to the country because the virus, it's international, but it knows borders. So it's important that we have different regulations between borders so that the authorities recognise that the virus knows what countries it's in. Again, I jest because of the ludicrous nature of the situation we find ourselves in. But more on the Freedom Convoy. As of this weekend, culminating in a 6-day standoff on the bridge in Ontario, where they hold the line at Ambassador Bridge at the US border. Now, on Friday, an Ontario judge ordered the protesters to end the blockade, at the bridge, given that it's an international crossing. And Ontario Premier Doug Ford declared a state of emergency, allowing for fines of up to 100,000 Canadian dollars and up to a year in jail for anyone who is illegally blocking the roads, bridges, or other critical infrastructure as a result of this ruling in the courts. Now, of course, having been on many protests myself, if the protests intervene with emergency services, etc., you're not doing it properly. There is plenty of ways to get your message heard, but protests by their very nature are disruptive. So inevitably, some roads and other infrastructure will be affected, and that's part of the process. Protests by nature are designed to disrupt and get people's attention. So despite the court ruling, the good news is the occupation did not end, and the Freedom Convoy participants continued over the weekend before on Sunday the protesters did disperse somewhat, allowing the bridge to reopen after this week-long standoff between the police and the protesters. But as a result, now the good news is that the convoy has swelled elsewhere, now with thousands continuing to join the truckers in Ottawa, where they've been encamped outside Parliament now for over a week. And the demonstrations there have continued for more than 2 weeks, with truckers and supporters blockading streets around Parliament to protest the mandates and other restrictions. Now, of course, this at the beginning went unnoticed in the mainstream media, but now the media is very much focused on it. And it seems the Canadian government are also now focused on it. It's gone from Trudeau's initial damning remarks describing those who are protesting as extremists and bigots and fascists and a whole manner of other terms, to now taking it a little bit more seriously, stating that he's willing to respond with whatever it takes. And it's been reported today that he may invoke the Emergencies Act to deal with the Freedom Convoy. Now, this has only been used once before in peacetime by none other than Justin Trudeau's father. Clearly runs in the family. Now, the 1988 Emergency Act allows federal governments to override the provinces with special measures. It was previously known up until 1988 as the War Measures Act, before it was repealed and replaced by the Emergencies Act. And it's only been used once before in peacetime and only 3 times in Canadian history in its entirety, during 2 world wars, and then in 1970 by Trudeau's father during the October crisis, which saw a series of terror attacks by a Quebec separatist group. Now, the law allowed for federal government to suspend civil liberties, as we've seen with some of the COVID restrictions, and it was in response to the questions of how far Trudeau Sr. would go in suspending liberties at that time was responded with the phrase, "just watch me." So this clearly is a trait that does run in the family, but whilst inspired maybe by his father, Trudeau Jr., denies having any plans yet to deploy the military. But he does say he's had enough of the protesters, and he's warned participants that they could face real consequences if they don't pack it up. And he shared a clear message in his words that to those taking part in the blockades and occupations, he says that they've been heard. Well, perhaps the evidence in Ontario is evidence of that, but I'm not so sure. But he does go on to say that there'll be consequences for breaking the law, and those consequences are going to become increasingly severe. So he's clearly making a warning to the protesters. He's also liaised with US President Joe Biden, talking about the barricades at the border. And it does seem that they are joining forces to tackle the Freedom Convoy. But this plays into the title of tonight's episode, Freedom versus Control in 2022. It's quite clear that those who wish to uphold freedom are now locking heads with those who seek to control. Now, we're 2 years in to this pandemic or this outbreak of COVID-19, and still we are seeing this authoritarian, draconian leadership style persist, even though that there is very clear evidence around the world that this, since the Omicron variant in particular, that this situation is much, much improved. Now, you've been watching me, hopefully, as many of you, for many, many months. We've done over 500 episodes covering all the real issues here. We haven't got time to cover why the whole situation is a fallacy in this episode, but let's presume that the issues here that stand across the world are serious on the basis that these nations still have wider restrictions than we have in England. But it's at this point in time where we have to realize that in 2022, the battle is not over. And even if one country suspends all restrictions, no one is really free until we're all free. And my personal view is we must unite around the globe now, whether it's innovative protests like convoys or other methods, to actually send a clear message that we will not be controlled, and that a small group of elite or political leaders do not have the right to determine how citizens live their lives. We've certainly been through a period of real impositions on our civil liberties and our rights, but that time is over, and it's important that we now push back, go all the way to end all these mandates and restrictions in every country around the world. and then move on to seek justice. But this piece around power and control, freedom versus control, is very evident, even down to the crowdfunding situation in Canada, where the latest series of attacks on the crowdfunding of the truckers has occurred over the last few days. The TD Bank in Canada has frozen 1.1 million Canadian dollars donated to the Freedom Convoy via the new crowdfunding site that the truckers are using, Give Send Go. But nonetheless, the CEO of that crowdfunding company has said he will defy a Canadian court order to stop dispersing funds to protesters. So the Toronto-based bank has paused the funds. Nonetheless, and this was done so under the court ruling that was placed last week, barring the distribution of the donations made through the platform. More than $9.2 million had already been raised for convoy supporters via the new platform, Go Send Go. But the company said they have no plans to back down, and that Canada has absolutely zero jurisdiction over how we manage our funds at Give Send Go. This is, of course, after GoFundMe froze $8 million in assets, in donations rather, following political pressure from politicians to the left side of politics in the main. Of course, now we know that this whole debacle has been smeared as left versus right, and that is a fallacy. Many of those who are protesting out there come from all political backgrounds. It's certainly been my experience here in the UK as well. But it's such a simple move to smear people as far right or otherwise. And even, I catch myself saying left-wing politicians, this is as it's been reported in the mainstream press. But we know that there has been an imbalance across the political divides. But really now this is why we must transcend this to actually take a stand for freedom more unilaterally in unity across the world. So we saw this crowdfunding campaign suffer due to this court process. But if that wasn't enough, over the weekend, there was a hacker attack on the fundraising platform, which has again further impinged the abilities of the truckers to actually receive the funds that people are willingly giving. And again, as a member of the public, if I freely choose to give money to any given cause, I don't expect any institution or government to determine who I can give money to. That should be a fundamental right. Just because we live in a digital world where those types of controls are possible, in days gone by, if I'd given a suitcase of cash to any given individual organization, you'd have no opportunity to prevent that, which is why, some people are talking about a return to cash. But actually, I'll go on to talk about in a moment how cryptocurrency may be providing the solution here as well. So as I mentioned, the site had already had funds frozen due to this court ruling, which again plays into this freedom versus control. The authorities are really trying to prevent any freedom of expression, to me, which is a fundamental attack on democracy. So once again, I've said it before, but the institutions that are supposed to represent the interests of the people and the public are really failing to uphold their duty. And I think we're witnessing an unfolding and unraveling of this on a global scale. So as I mentioned, this website was hacked. The donating the crowdfunding site was hacked on Sunday. This morning, there was a taunting video featuring a scene from Disney's Frozen with a message describing the Freedom Convoy as an insurrection led by known extremists. And again, it plays into that media bias, that media sensationalism, which has wrongly categorized many of the protesters, as we've seen in other parts of the world. But the hackers claim to have stolen the list of donors who contributed to the campaign, and they provided that information to a third-party website, which is now offering to share donor information with journalists and researchers. And of course, we know there's been some very large donations from previous reports with specific individuals from organizations who have the material wealth to support things like this. So their privacy is now at risk. Meanwhile, however, as I mentioned, 2 cryptocurrency fundraisers have now successfully been completed, and Canadian officials have become aware of these efforts. But the message is the grasp of tyrants is waning. These 2 crypto funds raised close to $1 million Canadian dollars in censorship-resistant digital assets, which is free from the clutches of the courts and of the governments. And again, in terms of the crypto and anarchists out there who are looking to take the libertarian pathway out of this, you can see how crypto uh, offers a way to free one's finances from the clutches of authorities and governments. And there will be a way. This is the battle for freedom and control, or control. And so far, freedom is starting to show the grassroots of succeeding. The other element to this is, of course, the truth. There's been many fallacies throughout the last 2 years. Many of those fallacies are now coming to light in the mainstream media, and there's many more to come. Now, this, of course, has triggered the initial trigger for the convoy in Canada was the fact that the truckers were forced to be vaccinated in order to do their job, which has caused price inflation and food shortages in Canada at a time where people are already struggling, which triggered the initial convoy, but since then has been co-opted by the freedom movement in Canada, and now other convoys around the world, including France, New Zealand, Australia, Netherlands, Belgium. And in New Zealand this weekend, a convoy of thousands of protesters converged on Parliament's lawn and its surrounding streets. And they were there from last Tuesday and still stand there today. In Australia, which has maintained some of the strictest measures throughout the pandemic, has also seen opposition now through a burgeoning protest movement over the last few weeks. A demonstration dubbed the Australian Freedom Convoy went on to its 11th day in the capital at Canberra, where thousands of protests gathered to protest the country's vaccine mandates, and there's further rallies planned. The French this weekend were out in style, despite the fact that the French authorities deployed thousands of police in Paris this weekend to prepare for the arrival of the French Freedom Convoy, inspired by the Canadian truckers. It started out from cities across France, heading towards, including Strasbourg, Lyon, Nice, Bayonne, heading into Paris over this weekend. But the police set up checkpoints into the French capital on key roads, stopped at least 500 vehicles, according to reports, from heading to the protest, which was banned and outlawed by the authorities. But many vehicles managed to slip through and disrupt the traffic and carry on. But as with we spoke about in Canada, the Parisian police warned that those taking part face a 2-year prison sentence, a driving ban, and a hefty fine. But that did not deter thousands taking part. Again, the battle for freedom versus control is thoroughly taking place in 2022 as many push back against these ongoing draconian restrictions. Not only these checkpoints, you may have seen footage over the weekend of tear gas fired at protesters at the Champs-Élysées after they defied the police order, with more horn honking as seen in Canada. They tried to disperse the demonstrators with these heavy-handed approaches, but the protesters were defiant. Now, Austria and Belgium have got on to ban protests inspired by the Canadian truckers. The reality is, with those who seek to control, all that's going to happen is people become more and more creative. You know, the convoys were a stroke of genius. They were a product of the time because of the very nature of those who were affected by the mandates were the truckers themselves. That inspired somewhat of a copycat movement across the world, inspired by the creativity, but also inspired in solidarity, recognizing that no one is free till we're all free, the freedom movement uniting around the world. But ultimately, people will get more and more creative. So you can ban any type of protest, but the people will continue. History shows us this. Every possible social movement that has faced this type of restriction, these type of controls, these type of anti-democratic approaches, or these undemocratic approaches, will persist. But not only will they persist, they will come back stronger. Now, here's the hard part. The fact that these protests are becoming illegal, and bans and fines and all kinds of draconian laws, the fact that Trudeau is looking at bringing this Emergencies Act forward, shows that the harder the demonstrators push, the harder the protesters push, the harder the push comes back in return. So we've got this like real grapple. It really is that fight between freedom and control. Now, I truly believe that truth will prevail. I do believe that freedom will prevail, but it's going to be tough. It's a tough ride. And it's particularly tough because of the way that this whole game has been rigged. with the media and the way that their uncompromising bias towards the overall narrative means that it's only been a trickle down effect for any real critical journalism to take a look at, and to start to dismantle some of the things that the protesters are actually standing up for. Because if you actually take the heat of the protest off the table and the frustrations about the authorities may be feeling about blocking the city's roads and all these justifications, when you actually take all of that noise off the table and you actually get to the root of the issues, there's very, very real issues that mean that these mandates and restrictions should never have come to bear. And it's quite clear that these impositions are rightly being challenged. Now, will these types of protests, will they create more of a distraction from the real issues? Or will they contribute to the cause? Time will tell. But it's really important that people have the ability to make their voices heard. The control mechanisms that have activated during the last 2 years will clamp down hard. Tonight I was going to talk about the free speech issue as well, because there's a showdown between freedom and control in terms of the authorities and those who are standing against the authorities. But there's also a showdown between new media and freedom of speech. We've seen so many of these legacy platforms, legacy media being uncompromisingly biased, but we're also seeing social platforms being incredibly heavy-handed with their censorship policies, deplatforming and censoring any critical voice, anything that threatens the narrative. So there really is a battle between freedom and control at every different level. So what we're seeing now in France, the tear gas is just the tip of the iceberg, and now Austria and Belgium trying to ban these protests is just another element to that. But nonetheless, today, Monday, the 14th of February, over 500 cars and camper vans arrived into Brussels this morning, mainly from France in convoy to protest against the restrictions. Despite this, the vehicles were tried to be, again, police tried to bar the vehicles from entering the city. But the convoys are still making their way through. Similarly, a convoy of vehicles took place in the Netherlands across The Hague in the city centre on Saturday, protesting against the restrictions. These convoys will continue to roll on. Again, over the weekend, an Israeli protest convoy took place. Despite the fact that now many of the restrictions are starting to ease in Israel, there's still plenty around. And this is about culture. This is about a culture now. It's not just about mandates. It's not just about restrictions. It's about the overall culture of respecting the right for freedom. It's about respecting one's individual choices. But none of this, if you actually take the time, even if you're a critical voice, to actually witness what's actually happening, none of this is against the solidarity of working together as society. It's all positioned as disruptive to unity. It's all positioned in the media as being a disruptive influence. But if you actually take the time to get to know protesters, you'll see that many of them actually represent the type of world that you perhaps want to create. Those who are critical of the protesters, if they took the time to actually understand the causes that they represent, and you strip away the kind of symptom level issues, you get to the core. We're all really battling the same thing. So my prediction that this summer we'll see a movement of movements. I believe that as the narrative begins to crumble, those social movements in other areas will start to see that we're all fighting the same battle: the centralization of power, the injustices and the inequalities that come with that, and the systems and structures of yesterday, how they are no longer suitable for today or tomorrow. Many of those who are fighting different battles will soon realize that we're actually all fighting the same battle, and freedom is at the core of that. And it's important that we continue to take that battle forward. The last piece I'll say is on the situation in New York. New York has again been very much draconian as an isolated piece within America. This weekend, this morning, it appears that thousands of New York City employees who refused to be vaccinated have now lost their jobs. There was a U.S. Supreme Court case that was rejected that blocked them. That failed to block the mandates. It was imposed last year by the former mayor, but the new mayor has then enacted it, and it looks like over 3,000 jobs, public sector jobs, will be lost. Obviously, this follows what we saw in England, the partial reversal of the NHS mandates, although there's still issues there. Many of us are aware of that. I'll talk more about that on the podcast in the coming weeks, or even the coming days. It's getting critical. But in the US, they didn't have such successes. and now 3,000 employees, which is only 1% of the workforce, but nonetheless, even though it's a low number, it's one of the largest or most sweeping examples of a workforce reduction that's been tied to a vaccine requirement in the country's history, in America's history. This is despite a coalition of unions, unlike in the UK, where the unions were less than supportive. But in America, a number of the unions representing different workers attempted to block the firings, but a judge on Thursday last week ruled in favor of the city. And now it's evident that thousands of workers will be losing their jobs today. Obviously, we're here on UK time. Things are unfolding there today as we speak. But the mayor of New York is hardening the line, saying that the federal workers must be vaccinated if they're to remain as New York City employees. And as the line used by Shadid Javid, saying that he's not firing them, people are quitting. The responsibility is clear. And again, that is coercion. That is force. It is not a choice. It is akin to firing them. It's putting them in a position where they have to choose between their jobs and their bodily autonomy. And that simply is unacceptable. And it's truly my hope that over the coming weeks and months, this type of global movement will seriously challenge further these violations of these rights as we stand tall and to make sure we preserve these rights, not only for now, but for the future. I suppose it gets slightly worse in America. They're now offering incentives again, financial incentives. Coercion isn't one thing, bribery is the other. Incentives to the New York workers to get vaccinated before the end of February. But it looks like it's going to be too late. The mandates have gone ahead and thousands of workers will lose their jobs. I do believe that justice will be done. This battle between freedom and control is going to be a tough one. Some are predicting civil war. You could argue if Trudeau pushes further forward with his Emergencies Act, you could see the stronghold of the protesters strengthening. It's unknown, but we have to be mindful of the future that we want to create. And I do believe that this year will create a transformative wave. I do believe we'll see a counterculture movement that is challenging the repression of the old. I do believe that movement will draw a line in the sand and said that everything that's behind this line will stay it will stay yesterday, and everything ahead of this line we will move forward with. But to do so peacefully, in a loving fashion, with compassion for all of humanity, because in order for us to create true transformation, we do need to build unity across people. So there's going to be some fascinating, challenging, but also beautiful times ahead, I believe. But I believe this world is now ripe for transformation, and those who have got their grip of control or striving to control that egoic, dark energy will subside as the global awakening takes place. It's my true belief that we will see a seismic movement over the next few months, even where the restrictions and mandates beginning to drop. This cultural movement will wish to drive change, this movement of movements in the wake of COVID-19, not only as we seek to repair the damages that have been incurred and start to heal and find greater meaning to move forward, but actually really to start forward facing and thinking about how we transform the world and society. And it's very clear to me that the institutions of yesterday are not fit for tomorrow. Yesterday's leaders should not be our leaders going into the future. But it's down to us to create that transformation. And this freedom movement that we're witnessing around the world right now is just a tip of the iceberg when it comes to creating that change. So if you feel drawn and inclined to be part of that change yourself, then I invite you to join us inside of the Elevate community. We've just launched the Elevate Network. Thousands of people have already joined. We're focused on both the activism side in terms of transforming the global position, removing mandates around the world. But more importantly, we're starting to look at how we transform ourselves in order to transform the world and start to build forward, how we can start to co-create the world moving forward from here. So it'd be my pleasure to invite you to join us inside of the Elevate Network. You can do that by visiting weareelevate.org, and it'd be my pleasure to welcome you inside of our private network. Thank you once again for tuning in. This exciting time is just about to begin, and I look forward to seeing you inside the Elevate Network, and I'll see you again on the Pandemic Podcast later this week.